Joining us to discuss the deployment of federalized National Guard troops to Chicago, Illinois, is Cooper Smith, Director of Homeland Security and Immigration with the America First Policy Institute. Cooper, let's start with President Trump on Governor Pritzker and Johnson there. Trump says the governor isn't protecting ICE immigration officers. Homeland Security says ICE agents have seen more than a 1,000% increase in assaults this year compared with the previous year. What are you seeing?
Well, it's not just assaults, it's also doxing. We're talking about people throwing pictures up on light poles and on the internet, on social media, using Discord and X to put out their identities and frankly put their families' lives in danger. So I absolutely believe the 1,000% increase in threats against ICE is real. And we're talking about multiple times in Texas just in the past month. People are taking pot shots at these federal law enforcement officers with sniper rifles. I mean, it's completely insane. So the president is right. And look, it is against the law, against Title 8, Section 1324 of the Immigration Nationality Act to harbor, conceal an illegal alien. So for some reason, they like to they talk about rights, right, for their people. But what about the rights of federal law enforcement to do their job and keep the American people safe? So I think the president's absolutely right. We should hold people accountable.
And do you think the president's threat has teeth? Is there legal basis for jailing the governor over the allegations?
Well, look, I mean, that's for the Department of Justice to decide. There'd have to be, proof and evidence of all of this. I will point out, though, that the mayor, Mayor Johnson of Chicago, actually put out an executive order calling federal law enforcement, calling ICE, calling CBP, calling the National Guard a credible threat. Now, it's a legal term that carries weight. Prosecutors use that term when they're talking about terrorists or other types of criminals. So he's telling residents of Chicago, potentially cartel members, gang members, that federal law enforcement coming into our city is actually a credible threat and an illegal military occupation. So I think this sort of violence-inducing rhetoric does need to be held accountable in the public sphere. And as I said before, it is against the law to harbor or conceal an illegal alien. It's against federal law.
And the White House is saying that some of these sites that they're sending National Guard troops to are under siege. In instances like this, where the conflict seems to be intensifying, what use is the National Guard? Why not just use other types of federal law enforcement?
Well, I would look to what the president's done in California and in Washington, D.C. I think the evidence speaks for itself that when you have an overwhelming show of force at the local level, especially when local law enforcement, local elected officials are not willing to do their job, the evidence points to actually great outcomes. We're talking about huge declines in murder rates and assaults and carjackings. So, the National Guard presence is helpful in immigration enforcement. It's helpful in beautification. We've seen that in Washington, D.C., and just general law and order. The evidence is overwhelming. Now, this is always going to be caught up in courts. We're talking about Title 10 and Title 2 authorities that the president is using with state governors. So they're always going to sue him for this, and he's going to ultimately try to be on the right side of history here.
Now, we heard it earlier. The Chicago mayor signed an executive order creating an ICE-free zone, citing alleged acts of brutality. How do you think those claims should be addressed?
Well, look, the mayor can say that ICE is not allowed on city-owned property, but of course the mayor does not own every piece of Chicago, and the federal government has the unique jurisdiction over immigration law. This is in the Constitution. So I would refer him to the Constitution on this issue, and the courts have sided, largely with President Trump on this issue. So he's free to make this kind of political kabuki theater. He's doing this to make a political point. But I would say one other thing to you and your audience. He's decrying federal help in his city and saying, we don't need help. We're totally fine. We're safe. I'm going to protect my citizens. But just last year, just 12 months ago, he went groveling to the Biden administration for $5 billion of federal money because of the $40 million per month his city was paying due to illegal immigration. So he does want to accept federal help when it's from President Biden, but if it's from President Trump, obviously he's trying to make a political point here.
But if there are concerns, as the mayor has, outlined that he's concerned that there have been acts of brutality there, how could those be addressed in terms of ICE agents?
I mean, we have seen acts of brutality, and they are predominantly coming from these activists who, when I watch these videos and I see this reporting that you're doing, what strikes me most is that these people are not they're not actually protesting. What they're typically doing is bringing cameras, trying to find a moment that they can turn into a social media sensation and get people on their side. So you see videos of this, and maybe 20% of them are legitimately protesting and have a legitimate disagreement with the president or his immigration enforcement priorities, and that's totally fine. But a large majority of them are just there to cause problems, get their cameras out, and get a social media ready moment. So all that aside, I worry most about the officers who are just trying to do their job and are being shot at. I think it was in July, a Border Patrol agent was shot in the neck in Texas. He wasn't inciting violence. He wasn't doing anything aggressive towards protesters. He was just doing his job.
Now, do you think the founding fathers envisioned this level of distrust between state and federal authorities? And how do you think they might have envisioned or tried to enable a path to keeping the country united?
Well, it's an interesting question, a sort of complicated answer there. I mean, the Bill of Rights was signed, and it actually wasn't even incorporated against the states for many decades after the Constitution was ratified in 1787. So it took a long time for actually the federal and state governments to come together and say we're going to unite on certain rights, freedom of speech and assembly, and hold people accountable for them. But I think the founders intentionally created a federal with a lowercase f system to empower states to make decisions. But over time, the federal government has grown in scope and authority, with Congress giving it new authorities pretty much every decade. So we are where we are. But one thing is not in question, and that is that immigration, naturalization is uniquely under the purview of the federal government.
Fascinating discussion. There's much more to dig into here, and I'm sure we'll be continuing this conversation over time with you. Cooper Smith, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.